Life's a loose cannon as the cameras roll. All the world's a suffering nest, aching souls. Mr. No keeps a chain in his greying clothes. Out here at the edge of the fire, planning to shame, planning to blame, it's all true. I said planning to pain all this tiresome game, lived out by you, lived out by you.
Hello, and welcome to the School of Enlightened Selfishness and our look at what is the correct development of a nine-centered being. And when I say the correct development of a nine-centered being, not what it is to be born conditioned and to go through a process of deconditioning, but what it means literally to come into the world through the serendipity of having correct parents, and in that correctness being raised correctly according to your strategy and authority, being raised correctly according to your dietary regimen. Everything about the nine-centered being, what it is to be us. First thing to understand is that physically we have gone through an evolutionary transition. That evolutionary transition took place in 1781. That is, this is the point at which we had the advent of the nine-centered being, that is the emergence of the nine-centered being in a world that had been dominated by the seven-centered being. Now, the thing about the seven-centered being, our ancestors prior to 1781, is that they had a Saturnian body. Life was ruled by the Saturnian cycle, that Saturnian cycle of approximately 30 years. Literally what it meant was that for most of the history of humanity, the essential aspects of life, that is, coming into the world, learning how to survive, bonding, making more, and then dying, was something that routinely took place within the first 30 years. In other words, this was the seven-centered life that it burned very hot, very short. It was the nature of its strategic movement in the world. We have a very different vehicle. These are vehicles, after all. And these are vehicles that are the byproduct of the design crystals that come into existence, that is, emerge onto this plane at different times in our evolutionary movement. The bodies that we have, these nine-centered vehicles, are Uranian. Now that does make a big difference, and a big difference in the most obvious and logical sense. That is, the Uranian cycle is 84 years. In other words, these vehicles are designed for a different kind of life. They aren't designed for the burning hot, fast, short out life that was the seven-centered model. This is a different model. It is a very slow movement. Think about the average teenager. Think about the average 15, 16-year-old. The average teenager in the developed world is a troubled being, regardless of the nature of their upbringing and so forth and so on. They're a troubled being because of the biological pressures and the realities that they deal with. In other words, at their Saturn midpoint, around 15 years of age, they are, historically speaking, they are ready to take on their responsibilities in the world. They are ready to get married and have children. They are ready to take on their life. But that's an old model. And the fact that we live in a world that is dominated by seven-centered consciousness, in other words, the moralities and philosophies and religions that were rooted in the seven-centered world, that it is exceedingly difficult for these children to handle this frequency. Their body is telling them one thing, history is telling them one thing, but to be a nine-centered being is different. For a nine-centered being, the half-life point is not 15, it's 40. Between 38 and 44, to be precise, because of the unusualness of the way in which the Uranian orbit operates. But the reality is that we are dealing with these very, very different bodies. Now think about what that means. If the half-life point, if the point at which you are ready to take your place in the world, if that half-life point is at 40, it immediately says something. It says that there is a great deal to learn. You know, we understood a lot about the development of survival mechanisms. If we're thinking about seven-centered beings, after the Second World War, the development of refugee services, the discovery of what were known as feral children, that is, children that survived on their own, parents destroyed in the war, they literally lived wild, grew wild. Now, one of the things that was discovered out of all of that is that it was exceedingly difficult for any child to survive if they were not at least 7 years of age. In other words, basically speaking, when we're thinking about the survival mechanism, and this is the whole basis of the seven-centered being, to survive, to triumph strategically, that what we're looking at is that everything they need to learn in their first 7 years. Now make that comparison to what we are as nine-centered beings. In other words, the very minimum for us is the first 20 years of life. Just the very minimum. You know, that equivalent to the previous 7. In other words, we have a very slow developing maturity. See, there's an enormous difference between the seven-centered child and the nine-centered child. And again, I'm talking about in the idealized sense. The seven-centered child has to master its survival. But the nine-centered child is here to master consciousness. These are very different things. Now, these cycles are within each other as we are in evolution. You know, the child is still going to go through its first 7 years to be able to handle its biological survival, but that is no longer the point. It is no longer the point at all. It is simply that movement in the same way that we have reptilian, mammalian, and then our neocortex brain. You know, it's all incorporated, but we're still up here now. You see, you are a child until you're 40. Actually, most people really know that, particularly men, you know. I mean, this is very different. And you see, these 40 years aren't about learning how to survive. It's not about that. That's not what we are for. See, I try to teach this to beings who are conditioned. Try to teach it to them, instead of them simply being that, because that's what it means to be raised correctly. And think about what that first 30 years really represents. That the most important thing for the development of consciousness is the development of individual authority, individual awareness coupled with correct nutrition. That's not about survival. That is about long-term well-being and intelligence. You see, the nine-centered being is so different from its predecessor. We are so different. We have a totally different movement. The theme today is planting the cross. You know, this cross that everybody is born with, this incarnation cross, this performance cross, because that's what it is, your ultimate potential to be able to perform your differentiated dance when you're correct. And it is not something that you can just put in the ground like somebody going in for a reading and saying, oh, that's my cross. It doesn't work that way. You see, this second stage from Saturn to Chiron, this is when the nine-centered being, the true nine-centered being, begins their journey in life. It's actually called living their storyline. This movement from Saturn to Chiron. The first thing that it represents is that 30-year mark, that point where you get to the Saturn return as a child that's been raised correctly, that has been nourished correctly, that's the point that you go out into the world on your own. It's when you leave the nest. Now, it isn't necessarily that you're staying at home with your parents till you're 30. You know, it is that nest that involves the way in which you are going to be educated, the way in which you are going to develop your identity. Because in order for you to even begin the process of planting that cross, you have to be you. Where you plant it is your environment. This is something that is really extraordinary. This is part of the knowledge of variable. And in the knowledge of variable, we have the 4 keys to transformation. The catalyst is always the same: strategy and authority, followed by dietary regimen. This is what is part of the first stage of the 9-centered development. And then we get to the transformation that moves from the second transformation to the third. This is all about our movement in life. This is related to the nodes of the moon in your human design, in your rave chart. It is along this line that we get our storyline. It is here that our life unfolds. Now again, I am speaking about an idealized situation. That unfolding of the storyline begins when one is in the correct environment. Now, environment is not the same as location. Environment is something extraordinary, because what environment represents is that it is the outside to the dietary regimen's inside. When you're taking in what is correct for you in terms of a differentiated dietary regimen, that nourishment is there to enhance your differentiation, your uniqueness, to enhance your sensory capacity. When you are in the right environment, it means that you are physically nurtured by the environment itself, which means there is less resistance, which means that there are those beings that you're going to meet through that environment that are correct for you. And it also means that by being in the correct environment, you're going to have the correct perspective. It takes 20 years to plant the cross, and after that, you can live it. But it takes 20 years. It is a natural process, and it is a natural process that begins with environment. Now, environment is a term. It is a term that is part of the primary health system. Environment is something that every single human being, by design, has an environment that is correct for them. Let me give you an example. You can have an environment like mountains. In other words, this is an environment where for those beings that it is correct for them, that it is part of their design, that they are always going to benefit from being on higher ground. They're always going to benefit from being on the top floor or on the side of a hill or whatever the case may be. They're always going to benefit from environments where there is actually less oxygen. It doesn't matter where that is. Location doesn't matter. Understand something about human design, because you get to see this. You get to see very clearly that this has nothing to do with the way in which seven-centered consciousness looks at things. When human design talks about food, it doesn't talk about food. It talks about the conditions or circumstances of how you take food into your body. It doesn't matter what it is. You know, my food circumstance is calm. I can eat the worst possible junk every day of my life. And as long as my circumstance is correct, I'm going to get precisely what I need, and I will not be unhealthy. It's not about the food. In the same way, it's not about the location. It's about the environment. It's that environment in which you fit into it like a glove. It's your place. That environment is something that can make a difference in your well-being on any given day. Take that mountain being who's a child and they're sick and they got a terrible fever. We'll take them upstairs, you know. And it'll already make a difference in their ability to be able to heal. We all have an environment, and it's only when you are in that environment that something very unique and extraordinary happens. You begin to see. You have to be in the right environment to see. You know, it's logical. I'm here. This is what I see. Where you are, what you see becomes the fodder of your mind. And the thing to understand about human beings, the thing that is revealed through variable, is that every single one of us have a unique perspective that establishes the foundation of our awareness. And without that unique perspective, we're just lost in homogenized consciousness. Everybody has a view. Everybody is here to see in a certain way that is natural for them, that is part of what is their uniqueness. And you see that movement along that line, that journey, because it's a journey, the developing of your storyline, the opening up of your cognitive potential, all of which takes place as you move from that point where you plant your cross in your environment and you begin to see. Now remember, you're seeing as yourself. This is a being that has been raised correctly. This is a being who is self-aware. This is a being who is operating out of their strategy and authority and who has been doing so all their life. They're not like you and me. I can't even truly grasp it yet, what that is. All I ever get to see is the results of deconditioning, which is wonderful, but it's not the same. You see, this interregnum, this middle stage, this Saturn to Chiron, this is where the great mystery is. And this is where the secret to the fulfillment of the potential of life lies. It is where you go and find your place in the true order. And in finding your place in the order, you begin to see in terms of the way in which you are able to see, to create the unique perspective. It is that unique perspective that ultimately becomes the foundation of what is your outer authority. Think about the nine-centered being, and let's go back to where I began. These bodies are so different. They're so different. You know, we have a world that's 51% emotional. We have literally hundreds of millions of beings who have open root centers, who bring enormous pressure to the world. Everybody's in a hurry. I mean, everybody's in a hurry. You expect your children to know what they want to do when they're 12, you know? Everybody's in a hurry. But you see, when you look at the life of the nine-centered being, the nine-centered being is not designed to be in a hurry at all. We're not this primitive, savage, seven-centered being racing around on a body that's burning out, trying to get the best out of whatever they can as fast as they can. But their survival mode. We're about consciousness, cognition. We are so different. You see, everything about this life, it begins with the recognition that it is what we will grasp that matters. I mean, this is the school of enlightened selfishness. See, anybody who is watching this, like myself, came into the world as a conditioned being. The deepest conditioning of all, was that we all had our authority taken away from us. That we were taught to give up our authority to this and that and the other. I mean, this is how we were raised. It is not an easy thing to divorce yourself of that. It is not. I know, I watch it in the world. There is no way that you can establish yourself as yourself on this plane without living only on your authority, no other authority. No God, no partner, no dog, no nothing. You see, the seven-centered being gave up authority as a natural way of survival. To give power to the stronger one who claims they'll protect you. To give power to the priest over you that says, yeah, you got a shitty life, we'll give you a better one. But you do what we tell you to do. The seven-centered being invented blackmail. We're not like that. It's not what we are about. We are about nurturing unique authority from the moment that a life comes into the world. We have no idea what it's like to be a being like that. We don't. For them, it is not a matter that it is a comparison to something. It will be their truth. It will not be something they learn, not something that they meet. It will be their truth. That's when you really get to see a nine-centered being who lives their entire life by their own authority. You can't survive as a nine-centered being in any other way. Otherwise, you're just homogenized and it's lost. It's the most difficult thing for anybody entering into human design to understand, that you have to live by your own authority no matter what it brings you. No matter what it does in relationship to the conventions that are around you, the expectations, all this and that. You want to wake up? Well, you wake up alone. You wake up according to your own authority, your own life. It doesn't leave you alone. You know, the storyline can never exist without the other. We are in a world with the other. But the correctness of what it is to be us in relationship to the other begins with our own authority. These 20 years, approximately 20 years, the Saturn to the Chiron, this is the glory that you get for being raised correctly. You get 20 years. You get 20 years in which you can naturally find your place. And in finding your place, not simply move through life without concern for survival, but with an ongoing development of your perception. That perception that ultimately leads to outer authority. Think about what happens to you when you come into human design. When you come into human design, you discover that you've never had any outer authority. It's the first thing you discover. What you discover is that your mind has been controlling your inner authority. And that anything that comes out of your mouth isn't outer authority. It's just the manipulations of your not-self mind, trying to control its environment. Such a thing. Eh? The way in which a human being is overwhelmed and taken over and lost. It happens all the time. It happens every day. The world is filled with it. You see, if you enter into this process, you really have to let go. And you have to let go of all those things that you think. Because you see, when the mind takes over, the glory of what we are is lost because our glory is outer authority, but true outer authority. When you come into design, we give you your true inner authority. It's the beginning of your freedom. It's the beginning of freedom from the control that the program has over you so that you can begin to operate correctly. You have to understand that as long as your mind is pretending to be both inner and outer authority, it cannot communicate the truth. It cannot. It can only communicate its distorted values relative to the way its not-self mind manipulates and operates. But you see, as a conditioned being, you have to go through this process of beginning the experiment of your strategy and authority, going through 7 years of deconditioning, cellular deconditioning. What you discover in that journey is that you begin to see differently. The moment that you take away what is incorrect for the mind, you begin to discover its beauty. The child that's raised correctly, that child that plants its cross in its right environment, that sets its view correctly, that those 20 years are an enormous development of awareness. Awareness. Unique, specific awareness with a unique, specific perspective that is natural for that being that is there to feed their awareness. So that ultimately, beyond the Chiron, that place beyond 50 when our kind is intended to flourish, that there is the possibility for true outer authority, true outer authority. That expression of awareness, differentiated, unique awareness, that is communication that is going to be, well, deeply, deeply exciting and moving to participate in. See, we're here to exalt one of our greatest gifts. Communication, our ability to be able to communicate to each other. And everything about the communication that we have experienced on this plane now is just mostly repetition. In the homogenized world, people just repeat formulas. This is not communication. You know? It's a brainwashing system, but it's not communication. Everything about what it is to be aware is the possibility to be able to communicate with awareness, which means there's no agenda. It doesn't carry any reason. It is just the joy to be able to express what one can express, nothing more, nothing less. See, we're not here to survive. The nine-center being's survival should be a given. We're here to exalt our potential. And we are here to do it uniquely. Uniquely. Each one of you. What lies there within you. That possibility to be able to express the perfected cognition that's yours. You see, this nine-centered being that starts correct, their life is nothing like yours or mine. They've been able to navigate correctly from the moment that they came into the world. That's a different life. Not a life that's threatened, but a rich, beautiful, aware existence. It's what we're here for. It's what we deserve. Well, nice that you participated. Till next time, bye for now.
There goes Mr. No in his black attire, strung out between the word and guitar desires. Now you're at the edge of the fire. out here at the edge of the fire. Out here at the edge